day. My name is Sabina Valentine, and I teach nutrition in the Faculty of Agricultural, Life and Environmental Science. This presentation is about using student feedback from self and peer assessment to improve communication skills in live Zoom classes. So here's a brief description of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to describe my course in which I use self and peer assessment, NUFS 310, Nutrition, Education and Communication, so as to provide a rationale for why I decided to use self and peer assessment. I'll provide some brief definitions of self and peer assessment, and I'll talk about how I use self and peer assessment in my nutrition course in NUFS 310. I'll talk about what went well and challenges encountered with self and peer assessment, and then I'll talk about implications for practice if you want to use self or peer assessment, and for myself for using self and peer assessment again. So in NUFS 310, this is Nutrition, Education and Communication. And this was taught in both the fall 2020 term as well as the winter 2021 term, both online. And in this course, students gain skills in teaching and communicating nutrition information effectively to different populations using a variety of modalities. So students listen to asynchronous lectures prior to coming to the live Zoom classes, and then in the live Zoom classes, they are given opportunities to practice the skills that were talked about in the asynchronous lectures. The live Zoom classes were once per week. So in the fall 2020 term, there were 66 students, which is quite a large amount. So we divided them in half and we had 33 students at a time in live Zoom classes. And myself and one teaching assistant found it quite challenging for students to receive feedback on their skills. And receiving feedback for skills, counseling skills, for example, was really important for improving the skills of the students for their future practice. So in the winter 2021 term, I had 11 students, and I saw this as a great opportunity to implement self and peer assessment strategies in a formative manner so that students could receive feedback on their skills. I also wanted to test this out because I really wanted to use it as well for my larger class, which is always in the fall term. So my objective for using self and peer assessment was to implement self and peer assessment to provide students with feedback on how to improve their counseling skills. So just to give you a bit of background before we talk about how I implemented self and peer assessment in my own course, self-assessment is the process whereby students reflect on their own strengths and weaknesses for the purpose of identifying their learning needs and deal with their weaknesses in order to improve achievement and/or performance. Peer assessment is the process whereby students are involved in giving feedback and grading the work of their peers. Now, grading doesn't have to be a necessary or required part of peer assessment. And in my class, actually, I used peer assessment and self-assessment formatively so that students were not graded on what the feedback that was provided by their peers. However, a necessary requirement of peer assessment is feedback. And peer feedback is the information provided by an agent, for example, a student, regarding aspects of one's performance or understanding. There are some skills required to develop your self-assessment and peer assessment model. So there are some technological skills required. For example, peer assessment requires some expertise and technical ability to set up your e-class, as well as to set up these activities in your live learning platforms such as Zoom. Self-assessment and peer assessment training are also a really good thing to include because they ensure that your students can provide some constructive feedback as well as engage in constructive self-reflection. So in NUFS 310, students actually had to watch a video on self-reflection, peer assessment, and how to give effective feedback to their peers. And they had to watch this video at the beginning of the course. This video also talked about the benefits that giving constructive feedback has on improving skills. You also want to make sure that you include some clearly articulated criteria for self-assessment and peer assessment. So criteria that's easy to understand, derive from your learning outcomes, and lead students to focus on issues significant to the learning outcomes. You want to make sure you have clear self-assessment and peer assessment methods. So the process really should be transparent and predictable. It should be an appropriate activity in terms of how it's related to the learning objectives. It should be participatory and social. And it should also include some self-assessment where students look at the criteria for the activity and reflect on their own performance or skills. Self-assessment and peer assessment should also provide some clear instructions. So instructions are a guide for participants to provide constructive feedback. So it will help students understand the purpose, significance, and benefits of using self-assessment as well as peer assessment. So this is how I used peer assessment in my own class, NUFS 310. So I used a peer assessment progression, which involved self-assessment. So just to recap, my overall objective was to have students implement the nutrition counseling flow steps when meeting with a mock client. So first, they had to watch a lecture on giving feedback, which described the purpose, significance, and benefits of giving feedback, as well as self-reflection and peer assessment. Then in the third class, we did an active listening skill activity in pairs. And after the activity, the students actually had to give anonymous feedback on what they felt went well and what they felt they needed to work on. So in this particular stage, in class 3, the reflection questions were actually quite open-ended and not quite as specific as they were in future classes, as they are in future classes. So in class 6, this is one of the classes where we introduce the steps to counseling flow. And again, students are put into pairs to do a mock counseling session, and then they trade off. And then after the session is over, students are actually asked as a group anonymously to provide some more specific comments on their own self-assessment. And these questions were done in Mentimeter, and they addressed each step of the counseling session. And then they also ended with things I did well and things that I need to improve for next time. And I asked the students then to choose one thing they wanted to improve. And for homework, I asked them to develop a plan to try and improve this particular aspect of their counseling session. And this is all done formatively. So in class 9, this is when I implemented counseling flow using peer assessment, because I felt that they had some practice doing some self-reflection, being able to evaluate an activity with certain criteria, and the criteria became more specific as the class progressed. So this is when I implemented peer assessment. And in this particular activity, students were divided into groups of 3, where one student was the mock client, one student was an active observer who was actually doing the peer assessment, and one student was a student counselor. So they went through a mock counseling session for about 7 minutes, and then the active observer provided feedback for the student counselor for about 3 minutes. So now let's move on to what went well with my self and peer assessment progression. So students took a lot of responsibility for their learning. So in doing so, the evidence of that responsibility came from the feedback that they provided to themselves in anonymously, right? I could see that in Mentimeter, as well as the feedback that they provided to their peers in their peer assessment. This activity also motivated and encouraged learners to work socially and share expertise. So it definitely increased the interactivity between the students, which was a good thing. The continuous feedback increased students' understanding of a particular topic and also gave them opportunities for self-improvement. It also reduced the level of anxiety before quizzes that they had in the class. So in the quizzes, I gave the students some mock case scenarios in which they had to describe how they would handle that particular session or situation. So the practice sessions in class were also very good preparation for these quizzes. The self and peer assessment also helped equip students for working life. In our working lives, we always strive to improve our own abilities and make things better. And so there's a great opportunity for self-reflection to occur so that they can apply this to their working lives. And in addition, in our working lives, we are also evaluated by our peers, our boss, for example, or our client or a patient. So this activity, the self and peer assessment, they were very good activities to help equip students for what they might encounter in their future careers. I also really liked the progression that I utilized for peer assessment, eventually getting to peer assessment. So by using kind of this gradual approach, I found that the students had a much clearer idea on how to provide constructive feedback during the self and peer assessment. And I also found that when we got to peer assessment near the end of the course, because students had developed all of these relationships with one another throughout the course, I think it gave them a safe learning space for the reception of peer assessment. So some of the challenges associated with self and peer assessment that I implemented in NUFS 310, they gave me some great ideas on how I can improve my own model for future classes. Number one, there wasn't enough time for peer assessment. 3 minutes was not enough time, so that definitely needed to be increased. In addition, you need to make sure that you provide clear instructions on the activity and the measurement outcome of the learning objectives, as well as provide clear evaluation criteria for the self and peer assessment. Some students got a bit confused about, for example, what the instructions of the activity were, the criteria in which they had to do a self or peer assessment. So you just have to make sure that those instructions or evaluation criteria are very clear. Some students were uncomfortable providing feedback to their peers or were not open or receptive to feedback from their peers. And some students were not prepared to give valuable feedback due to lack of class preparation. For example, they may not have listened to the asynchronous lectures before class, so they really didn't have the knowledge on how to implement the criteria used to assess peers. So I just wanted to provide some implications for using self-assessment and peer assessment activities in your courses. Number one, provide clear guidance about the value in providing clear feedback to peers and the value of being open to receiving feedback. So make sure students know that it can be difficult actually to receive feedback as well as to give feedback. But if you provide very clear instructions on how to give feedback and the value of giving feedback, this will really encourage students to make more objective assessments of their peers in a constructive way. So I also think that gradually working towards peer assessment and providing practice activities for students so that they can work their way up to providing peer assessment is also a valuable progression that you can use when giving peer assessment feedback. So work individually with students struggling to give and/or receive feedback. This may require working with these students after class or jumping into that breakout room to provide some guidance. Provide clear criteria on how to evaluate or assess yourself or your peers. Ensure that there is enough time for peer assessment, which I always seem to run out of in my classes. So maybe not doing so much and keeping things simpler, and ensuring that there is enough time for peer assessment would be a good idea. Ensure that students are clear on what they have to do before class. This will increase the knowledge of the students on a topic so that they are better at knowing what or how to evaluate themselves or their peers. So in the future, this process of self and peer assessment will allow students in a large class to receive personalized feedback that is constructive and accurate. So I look forward to any questions that you may have about this presentation on June 29th between 2 and 2:30. Enjoy and have a great day.